Neighbors laughed when the ex-sniper built a second wall around his cabin until the blizzard came. Cade Brennan measured the distance between his cabin's original log wall and the new wooden barrier he was constructing 3 feet away from it. The gap looked strange, purposeless to anyone watching from the dirt road below. Vernon Tucker had driven by twice this morning, slowing his pickup truck each time to stare and shake his head. The other neighbors whispered about the crazy veteran who lived up the mountain, wondering what paranoid delusion drove him to waste perfectly good lumber on something that made no sense. But Cade knew exactly what he was building, and why every inch of that 3-foot space would matter when winter came early this year. 6 months had passed since Cade moved to this isolated stretch of Colorado mountain country, purchasing the old Henderson cabin with cash from his military pension. The locals in Pine Ridge had expected him to fix the sagging porch or replace the rusted metal roof. Instead, he spent his days constructing this mysterious second wall that wrapped around his entire cabin like a wooden shell. Luna Castellanos was the only person who hadn't mocked his project. The veterinarian lived 2 miles down the mountain and often stopped by on her way to check on sick cattle at the Morrison Ranch. She watched him work without judgment, sometimes bringing coffee in a thermos and asking practical questions about his construction techniques rather than questioning his sanity. The wall stood 8 feet tall, matching the height of his cabin's eaves perfectly. Cade had cut every board to precise measurements, leaving calculated gaps for ventilation that most people assumed were mistakes. He'd installed a series of small vents near the ground level and larger ones near the top, creating what looked like random holes to the untrained eye. Vernon Tucker had made several comments at the general store about how the crazy sniper couldn't even build a proper fence, getting laughs from the morning coffee crowd who gathered there to share gossip and complaints about their own neighbors. But Cade had learned patience during his 12 years of military service. He understood that preparation often looked like madness to people who had never faced real danger. His weather radio crackled with hourly updates, and the atmospheric pressure readings he took 3 times daily with his barometric gauge showed a pattern that made his chest tighten with recognition. The signs were all there for anyone trained to read them. The migrating birds had left 2 weeks earlier than usual. His neighbors' horses stood clustered together in the far corner of their pasture, heads turned away from the northwest wind. Even the local wildlife behaved differently, with deer moving to lower elevations and bears appearing near homes as they searched for food before their winter hibernation. Tomorrow he would finish installing the final boards on the north side of his second wall. Then he would begin filling the 3-foot space between the walls with the materials he had been stockpiling in his barn since August. The barn doors creaked open as Cade wheeled out the first load of insulation materials on his flatbed cart. Rolls of fiberglass batting, sheets of reflective foil barrier, and bags of loose-fill cellulose created a mountain of supplies that represented months of careful planning and purchasing. He had driven to 3 different hardware stores in neighboring towns to buy these materials, spreading out his purchases so no single clerk would remember the quantity or ask questions about his project. Military training had taught him that operational security meant keeping information compartmentalized, even in civilian life. Luna's white veterinary truck climbed the steep driveway as Cade began stuffing the first roll of insulation into the narrow space between his cabin wall and the new outer barrier. She parked near his workshop and walked over with her characteristic confident stride, medical bag slung across her shoulder and work boots crunching on the gravel. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held the same steady intelligence that had drawn his attention during their first meeting at the feed store. She examined his progress without speaking, watching as he carefully positioned the insulation to avoid blocking the ventilation gaps he had built into both walls. The methodical precision of his work impressed her. Every movement served a purpose, every measurement exact. She had seen enough ranchers and handymen around Pine Ridge to recognize the difference between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who was just improvising. After 20 minutes of observation, she finally spoke. Her voice carried the directness he appreciated in people who worked with their hands and understood practical problems. She asked why he was insulating a wall that already had a cabin wall behind it, and whether this had something to do with the weather instruments she had noticed mounted on his roof. Her questions showed she had been paying attention to details that other neighbors missed or dismissed. Cade paused in his work, considering how much to reveal. Trust was something he rationed carefully after losing too many friends to poor intelligence and operational failures overseas. But Luna's presence at his property had become a source of comfort rather than suspicion. She never pried into his past or demanded explanations for his choices. Her acceptance of his privacy had earned his respect in a way that Vernon Tucker's loud criticism never could. He explained that the space between the walls would trap air and create additional thermal protection, comparing it to the double-walled construction used in extreme cold weather shelters. His words were measured, revealing function without exposing his deeper concerns about what was coming. Luna nodded with understanding, mentioning that similar principles applied to the insulated barn designs used by ranchers who wintered livestock in harsh mountain conditions. As she prepared to leave for her next appointment, Cade found himself hoping she would stop by again soon. Her quiet competence reminded him of the best soldiers he had served with, people who understood that preparation was never paranoia when lives depended on being ready. 3 days later, Cade hammered the final board into place on the north wall, completing his mysterious second barrier. The sound echoed across the mountain valley, reaching Vernon Tucker's ears as he loaded feed sacks at the Morrison Ranch below. Vernon paused in his work, shaking his head with disgust at the crazy veteran who had wasted an entire month building something that served no logical purpose. He made a mental note to share his observations with the coffee crowd at the general store, where Cade's peculiar construction project had become a source of daily entertainment and speculation. The completed outer wall stood exactly 3 feet from Cade's original cabin, creating a uniform gap that ran around the entire perimeter of his home. From the outside, it looked like an oversized wooden fence that someone had built too close to their house. The carefully calculated ventilation holes appeared random to untrained eyes, and the lack of any visible entrance or gate into the enclosed space made the whole structure seem even more pointless to casual observers. Cade began the next phase of his preparation immediately. He had ordered 12 tons of wood pellets from a heating supply company in Denver, telling the delivery driver they were for a large pellet stove installation. The white paper bags filled half of his barn, stacked in neat rows that represented enough fuel to heat a normal cabin for 3 winters. But Cade's calculations were based on heating requirements that went far beyond normal circumstances. His weather monitoring equipment showed atmospheric pressure dropping faster than any normal seasonal change. The barometric readings reminded him of conditions he had experienced during mountain training exercises in Afghanistan, where sudden weather shifts could trap entire units in deadly situations within hours. His military-grade weather radio received updates from National Weather Service stations across Colorado, and the long-range forecasts mentioned an unusual polar vortex system moving south from Canada earlier than meteorologists had ever recorded. Luna arrived as he was moving the first dozen bags of wood pellets from the barn to the space between his walls. She noticed immediately that his project had entered a new phase, and her veterinary training helped her understand the implications of creating a heated airspace around an entire building. She asked direct questions about his heating plan and whether he expected to lose power for extended periods during the coming winter season. Her questions revealed that she had been thinking about his project more seriously than their previous conversations indicated. She mentioned concerns about her own ranch animals if severe weather struck the area, and asked whether his preparations were based on specific weather forecasts or general caution about mountain winter conditions. The intelligence in her brown eyes showed she was connecting details that other neighbors missed completely. Cade found himself explaining more than he had intended. He told her about pressure systems and Arctic air masses, sharing knowledge gained from survival training in extreme environments where weather meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. His words carried the weight of experience rather than theory, and Luna listened with the focused attention she gave to complex veterinary diagnoses. That evening, Cade's weather radio crackled with an emergency bulletin from the National Weather Service. A massive Arctic system was building strength over northern Canada, with computer models showing unprecedented cold air masses moving toward the Rocky Mountain region within the next 2 weeks. The meteorologist's voice carried unusual concern as he described temperature drops that could reach 40 degrees below zero, accompanied by sustained winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and snowfall totals that might break century-old records. Cade turned up the volume and listened to every word of the extended forecast. His military training had taught him to identify the difference between routine weather warnings and genuine emergency situations. This bulletin contained language patterns he recognized from combat zone intelligence reports, where understated official warnings masked catastrophic potential. The phrases about life-threatening conditions and extended power outages told him everything he needed to know about what was coming to Pine Ridge. He spent the next morning installing a backup heating system between his double walls, The wood pellet stove he had purchased could heat the airspace around his entire cabin, creating a thermal barrier that would maintain livable temperatures inside, even if his main heating system failed completely. He ran flexible ductwork through the carefully planned ventilation gaps, creating air circulation patterns that would distribute heat evenly throughout the enclosed space between the walls. Vernon Tucker drove by again during the installation, this time stopping his truck to lean out the window and shout questions about whether Cade was planning to heat the outdoors like some kind of millionaire with more money than sense. His voice carried across the mountain air with mockery that made Cade's jaw tighten with familiar irritation. The same dismissive attitude he had encountered from rear echelon officers who questioned field preparations until crisis proved their necessity. Luna appeared at noon with sandwiches and coffee, watching him work with growing understanding of his project's true purpose. She mentioned that her own weather radio had been broadcasting increasingly urgent warnings about the Arctic system, and that several ranchers in the valley were making emergency preparations to move livestock to protected shelters. Her veterinary practice had been receiving calls from concerned animal owners, asking about cold weather survival strategies for outdoor pets and working animals. She asked whether his double wall design would maintain enough heat to prevent frozen pipes and structural damage during extended sub-zero conditions. Her practical questions showed she was beginning to grasp the scale of the weather emergency he was preparing for, and her tone carried none of the skepticism that colored other neighbors' comments about his project. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Cade tested his heating system for the first time. Warm air flowed through the ductwork and began filling the space between his cabin walls, creating a cocoon of heated protection around his home. The system worked exactly as he had calculated, proving that his months of planning and construction would provide the survival advantage he needed when the Arctic system arrived in Pine Ridge and transformed his mountain community into a frozen wasteland where unprepared neighbors would face life-threatening danger. 2 days before the Arctic system was scheduled to reach Colorado, Cade made his final preparations. He filled every available container with water, knowing that frozen pipes would cut off his supply once temperatures dropped below zero for extended periods. His generator sat ready in the insulated shed he had built behind his cabin, surrounded by enough diesel fuel to run for 2 weeks without interruption. The backup heating system between his walls had been tested 3 more times, proving that his double-wall design could maintain comfortable indoor temperatures, even when outside conditions became deadly. Vernon Tucker's attitude began changing that morning when his own weather radio started broadcasting emergency warnings every 30 minutes. The National Weather Service had upgraded their forecasts to include phrases like potentially historic storm system and life-threatening conditions expected. Vernon drove up to Cade's property around noon, parking his truck near the completed second wall and walking around the structure with new interest instead of his usual mockery. He asked direct questions about the construction timeline and whether Cade had received advanced weather information from military sources. His tone carried grudging respect rather than the dismissive humor that had characterized their previous interactions. Vernon admitted that several ranchers in the valley were now scrambling to move livestock into barns and purchase emergency heating supplies from hardware stores that were already running low on inventory. Luna arrived during Vernon's visit, creating an awkward 3-way conversation where 2 locals tried to understand what the veteran had known weeks ahead of everyone else. She mentioned that her veterinary clinic had been fielding panic calls from pet owners asking about cold weather survival strategies, and that the animal shelter in town was preparing for emergency overcrowding as people brought in outdoor animals they couldn't properly protect. Cade explained his weather monitoring routine, showing them the barometric pressure readings he had been tracking for months. The data revealed atmospheric patterns that preceded major Arctic systems, information he had learned during survival training in Alaska, where sudden weather changes killed unprepared soldiers regularly. His knowledge came from practical experience rather than theoretical study, and both neighbors began to understand that his preparations were based on genuine expertise rather than paranoid speculation. As evening approached, the first signs of the approaching storm became visible to untrained eyes. The wind shifted direction and increased velocity, carrying the sharp cold that preceded major temperature drops. Snow clouds gathered on the northern horizon, their dark mass stretching across the entire sky like a gray wall moving steadily south toward Pine Ridge. The air pressure continued dropping at rates that made Cade's ears pop, and the complete absence of birds or small animals created an eerie silence that even Vernon noticed. That night, Cade activated his backup heating system for continuous operation. Warm air began circulating through the space between his walls, creating a thermal barrier that would protect his home when the full force of the Arctic blast arrived within hours. The Arctic blast hit Pine Ridge at 3 in the morning, with winds that shook every building in the valley. Temperature readings on Cade's digital thermometer dropped 18 degrees in the first hour, plummeting from 20 above zero to 2 below within minutes of the storm's arrival. Snow began falling in sheets so thick that visibility disappeared completely beyond 10 feet in any direction. The wind howled around his cabin with sustained speeds that exceeded 50 miles per hour, creating a constant roar that drowned out all other sounds. Inside his protected cocoon, Cade remained comfortable and warm. His double-wall system worked exactly as designed, with heated air circulation maintaining a steady 70 degrees throughout his living space, while the exterior walls absorbed the full assault of the Arctic conditions. He monitored his backup heating system every hour, checking fuel consumption rates and air circulation patterns to ensure optimal performance during the storm's duration. By dawn, the temperature had fallen to 22 degrees below zero, with wind chill factors pushing the effective temperature down to -50. Power lines began failing throughout the valley as ice accumulated on cables and high winds toppled utility poles. The electrical grid serving Pine Ridge went dark at 7 in the morning, leaving most residents without heat or light during the worst storm conditions anyone could remember experiencing. Cade's generator automatically activated when the main power supply failed, providing electricity for his essential systems without interruption. His months of preparation had included backup plans for every critical need, from heating and lighting to communications and food storage. The diesel fuel he had stockpiled would keep his generator running for weeks if necessary. While his neighbors faced rapidly cooling homes and no reliable way to restore warmth once their firewood supplies ran out, Luna's veterinary truck appeared through the blizzard around noon, crawling up his driveway at walking speed with emergency flashers blinking through the snow. She had attempted to check on isolated ranchers and found several families already in serious trouble from heating system failures and frozen water pipes. Her truck's heater could barely keep pace with the cold air seeping through door seals, and she was shivering despite wearing every layer of winter clothing she owned. Cade opened his door to find her standing on his porch, snow covering her from head to boots and ice crystals forming on her eyebrows from her frozen breath. She asked whether his heating system could accommodate additional people, explaining that the Morrison family down the mountain had lost their furnace when a power surge damaged their electrical panel. Their elderly parents were showing early signs of hypothermia, and the children were crying from cold, despite being wrapped in every blanket the family could find. Without hesitation, Cade told her to bring them up immediately. His thermal protection system had been designed with surplus capacity, and his cabin could safely shelter several additional people during the emergency. The double-wall construction that neighbors had mocked for months would now serve as the only reliable refuge available to families whose conventional heating systems had failed under extreme conditions that no one except Cade had anticipated or prepared to survive. Luna returned within an hour, leading a convoy of 3 vehicles crawling through the blizzard at walking speed. The Morrison family's truck carried elderly parents wrapped in sleeping bags, while their adult children followed in a second vehicle with supplies they had managed to gather before their heating system failed completely. Vernon Tucker brought up the rear in his pickup truck, transporting 2 more families whose propane heating systems had run out of fuel during the night. Cade opened his door to find 8 people standing on his porch, all shivering despite wearing multiple layers of winter clothing. Ice crystals covered their faces, and frost had formed on their eyebrows from breathing in the sub-zero air. The elderly Morrison patriarch showed clear signs of mild hypothermia, with confusion and slurred speech that indicated his core body temperature had begun dropping to dangerous levels. Inside the warm cocoon created by his double-wall heating system, the refugees immediately began recovering from their cold exposure. Cade's living space easily accommodated the additional people, with his backup heating system automatically adjusting to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the expanded occupancy. The thermal barrier between his walls distributed heat so effectively that no one needed to crowd around a single heat source or compete for the warmest spots in the room. Vernon Tucker stood near the window, watching snow pile up against the outer wall while warm air circulated around him. He admitted that his own heating system had failed 2 hours earlier when frozen pipes burst and flooded his basement, destroying his furnace and leaving his house uninhabitable during the storm. His voice carried genuine gratitude mixed with embarrassment as he apologized for months of mocking Cade's construction project without understanding its purpose. More neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon as heating systems failed across the valley. Each knock on the door brought another family seeking shelter from conditions that were killing unprepared people throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Cade's cabin became the unofficial emergency shelter for Pine Ridge, with his thermal protection system providing life-saving warmth to 15 people who would have faced hypothermia or death in their own homes. Luna coordinated the refugee families, using her veterinary training to monitor everyone for signs of cold exposure and frostbite. She mentioned that radio reports from town described widespread power outages, frozen water systems, and several weather-related deaths in communities that lacked adequate emergency shelter. The storm had exceeded all predictions, with temperatures reaching 30 degrees below zero and wind speeds that made travel impossible for emergency vehicles. As night fell on the second day of the blizzard, Cade's weather radio announced that the Arctic system would continue for at least 2 more days before moving south toward New Mexico. His fuel supplies remained adequate for extended operation, and his heating system continued functioning flawlessly despite the extreme demand. The double wall design that had seemed like paranoid over-engineering now proved to be the only structure in Pine Ridge capable of protecting human life during the worst natural disaster in the region's recorded history. On the 4th morning, the wind finally stopped howling around Cade's cabin. His weather radio announced that the Arctic system was moving south, with temperatures expected to rise above zero within the next 12 hours. The blizzard had lasted 3 days and claimed dozens of lives across Colorado, making it the deadliest winter storm in state history. Pine Ridge had suffered 6 fatalities from hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning, but every person who had sought shelter at Cade's cabin survived without serious injury. As the snow stopped falling, the full extent of the disaster became visible through cleared windows. Power lines lay broken under the weight of accumulated ice, and several houses in the valley showed damage from burst pipes and collapsed sections where heating systems had failed completely. Vernon Tucker's home had 3 feet of snow piled against doors and windows, with ice covering every surface inside the rooms where his heating system had failed on the storm's first night. The 15 people sheltered in Cade's cabin began venturing outside as temperatures climbed toward 10 degrees above zero. The Morrison family patriarch, who had arrived showing signs of hypothermia, was now fully recovered and helping other families assess damage to their properties. Children who had cried from cold 3 days earlier were now playing in the deep snow, their parents watching with relief and gratitude for the warmth that had saved their lives. Vernon Tucker spent an hour examining Cade's double-wall construction, understanding for the first time how the heated airspace had created a thermal barrier that protected everyone inside. He asked detailed questions about the insulation materials, ventilation design, and heating capacity that had made survival possible during conditions that killed people in conventional structures. His respect for Cade's expertise replaced years of suspicion and mockery with genuine admiration. Luna stood beside Cade as they watched families prepare to return to their damaged homes. She mentioned that emergency crews were already working to restore power and clear roads, but full recovery would take weeks in the aftermath of such an unprecedented storm. Her eyes held warmth and appreciation as she thanked him for opening his home to everyone who needed shelter, transforming what could have been a community tragedy into a story of survival and preparation. As the last family departed, Cade found himself alone with Luna in his cabin, for the first time since before the storm began. The heating system between his walls continued operating quietly, maintaining comfortable temperatures while ice melted from the exterior surfaces of his protective barrier. She asked whether he planned to stay in Pine Ridge permanently, and whether his construction project had been intended specifically for emergency situations like the blizzard they had just survived. Cade explained that his military training had taught him to prepare for worst-case scenarios, but he had built his thermal protection system as insurance against any extreme weather emergency that might threaten the mountain community. The double wall design would serve him well for decades, providing both everyday energy efficiency and crisis-level protection whenever nature tested human preparedness again. Vernon Tucker returned that evening with a proposal from the Pine Ridge Community Council. They wanted to hire Cade as an emergency preparedness consultant, helping other residents design backup heating systems and survival shelters based on his proven expertise. The neighbors who had laughed at his construction project now recognized him as the person whose knowledge and preparation had saved their lives when nature revealed the deadly consequences of being unprepared in the American West. Thanks for joining us for this incredible survival story from the American West. Click the video on your screen to experience another thrilling Western tale. And don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to support bringing you more amazing stories like this one.